Okay, we're going to go ahead and look at the canon in this presentation. And once again, we probably know that this is a very extensive topic, so I'm going to go ahead and give some recommended readings here. I'd say some of these are more advanced treatments of the topic, but they're still very good. Obviously, they're very good. I wouldn't be recommending them. So we have on the far left here the Biblical Canon by Lee MacDonald. We have F.F. Bruce's The Canon of Scripture. We have some of Michael Kruger's work. He is a New Testament scholar that specializes in canon. And then on the far right, we have a book by Craig Evans and Emmanuel Tove called Exploring the Origins of the Bible. So those are some very good resources, but they're a little more intermediate or advanced. If you want a more general introduction, I recommend Norman Geisler and William Nix's book here, From God to Us, How We Got the Bible, and a General Introduction to the Bible. So feel free to go deeper on this topic with those resources. Now, the canon became a major issue in the public spotlight a ways back when Dan Brown wrote his book, The Da Vinci Code, and it became a nationwide bestseller and made him very rich. Hollywood decided to go ahead and make it into a movie, and then everybody was writing books on responses to the Da Vinci Code. I remember when it came out, and I remember all the Christian apologists writing short little booklets to respond to the Da Vinci Code. And why did they have to do that? Well, the Da Vinci Code is fiction. It's based on historically based fiction, but in the book, they accused a secret Catholic society of concealing a sexual relationship between Jesus and Mary. And then, of course, supposedly later on in about the 4th century, a bunch of church leaders came together and decided what books were supposed to be in the Bible. And sadly, hundreds of thousands of people read the Da Vinci Code and concluded that is how the canon of Scripture came to be, by a bunch of church leaders in the 4th century deciding what books belonged in the Bible. So it was more or less a power control thing, and people ran with it as if it was true, but it was actually based on fiction. And Dan Brown actually says here in the Da Vinci Code, he says here, more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relative few were chosen in inclusion: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Bible as we know it today was put together by the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, and Constantine commissioned and financed a new Bible, which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those Gospels that made him godlike. And the earlier Gospels are outlawed to gather up and burn, and the modern Bible is compiled and edited by men who possessed a political agenda to promote the divinity of the man Jesus Christ and use his influence to solidify their power base. So sadly, a lot of people believe this was actually true, and that's how they came to believe this is how the canon of Scripture came to be. So many Christian apologists had to respond to this nonsense back when the Da Vinci Code was released. And so let's move on to some of the questions that come up with canon. So number one, does the canon debate matter? Why does it matter? Number two, do we have the correct books in the Bible? Number three, who decided what books are in the Bible? Number four, who has the correct canon, the Protestant canon or the Catholic canon? And did the Jesus and the apostles have a fixed canon that they used, and was the canon fluid at the time of Jesus? That means that perhaps they didn't have a fixed set of books they were reading from the Old Testament. Maybe there were other books they were reading as well. We'll talk about that as we move forward here. Why the canon is important, because the question of whether the canon is open or closed has serious ramifications on religious movements today. Because if God is giving new revelation today that can be written down, that means Muslims have a case that the Quran is a true revelation from God, and the Book of Mormon could be true as well, because both of those religions believe that their leader was given new divine revelation that basically showed the previous revelation of the Bible was inferior or corrupted, and we need new revelation. And so if God is giving new revelation today, then any religious movement can get started, and most likely they'll all contradict each other as they do. So whether the canon is open or closed is very important. Now, if they did possibly find a book someday, as I say, number one here, if they did find a book that was accredited by or written by an accredited apostle or prophet in the first century, in order to see if that is really a book that should belong in the canon that was left out, they would have to see whether it passes the test of canonicity. So remember, we need to ask, as I say, number four here, why would God leave something that is necessary for the instruction of believers of all generations unknown for so long? Something else that came up that really challenged the issue of canon or made it a more important issue was the discovery of the Nag Hammadi scrolls. And these were discovered in Egypt in 1945. They're a collection of writings of the Nag Hammadi scrolls, or the codices, and these made up what is called the Gnostic writings. And when it comes to the Gnostic Gospels, there is a scholar that is specialized in this. Her name is Elaine Pagels. If you're not familiar with Gnosticism, there was a group of people that claimed to be followers of Jesus called Gnostics. And they had a very different view of Jesus than what you read in the New Testament. They believed Jesus was a transmitter of secret knowledge, and only those that had special insight or were specially endowed or capable could receive this secret insight, very esoteric sounding. And they believed that Jesus was not God incarnate because they believed the body is bad and evil. And so if you read the book of Colossians, there's some things that Paul talks about there. Some scholars say he's not addressing Gnosticism, but just depends on who you talk to. But the point is that Gnosticism was a real problem for the early Christian movement. And we know that these books came out, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and then it became an issue. And these were all dated around the second century, mid-second century and onward. And except for the Gospel of Thomas, maybe a little before that. But the point is that there have been a lot of responses to why the Gnostic Gospels are not included in our canon. And of course, the dating has an issue, but you can read the Gnostic Gospels. You can get books on them and read them online. No one's hiding them. And you can read how different they are from the four Gospels that you read, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we can do that. And then, of course, there were many books that came out, these sensationalists on sensationalism, these issues such as the Judas Gospel, the Lost Gospel about Jesus, Jesus's relationship with Mary, and of course the Gospel of Thomas. And so we've had scholars write on this topic. Some of them have even written responses to it. You had Bart Ehrman writing books in response to the Judas Gospel. Of course, he has his own book on lost scriptures. And then, of course, we had Elaine Pagels come out with another book, Beyond Belief, on the Gospel of Thomas. And so what happened was we had to start writing books in response to the Gnostic Gospels. And that's why we have books like The Heresy of Orthodoxy by Michael Kruger and The Missing Gospels by Darrell Bock. But all in all, the Gnostic Gospels are dated much later than the four Gospels that we have. And if you read them carefully, you will see all the embellishments in them. They're very, very different from the four Gospels that we have, or somewhat different. So go ahead and read them and make your own comparison. And we can find out why they didn't make it into the canon. Now, if we try to define canon, that means what it originally meant was called measuring reed, which basically began to develop into the meaning standard, and that refers to those books accepted by the ecclesia as the standard that governs belief and practice and conduct. Sometimes people refer to canon as the rule of faith of the normative writings or the authoritative scriptures. And remember that inspiration is the means by which the Bible received its authority, but canonization is the process by which the Bible receives its acceptance. Number four, remember, canonicity is a study that treats the recognition and collection of the books given by God's inspiration. Also, remember, we are careful to say that God determined the canon and the church discovered the canon. The canon of Scripture was not created by the church, rather the church discovered and recognized it. Now, that's going to lead to a debate on what the church is, or who the true church is, and how we translate the word church as well in the New Testament. So that's a topic for another time, but whoever you think the church is, or whatever you think the church is, will play a role in how you view the canon. Remember, there's a issue of mystery to the canonization similar to inspiration because there's going to be a human element and divine element. Number one here is we believe God gives the divine authority to a book and the men receive it. Number two, God reveals to his people. He reveals and his people recognize what he reveals. Canonicity is determined by God and discovered by man. So, of course, number three, once the book is recognized by the people of God to be the word of God, then the Bible becomes the active canon or rule by which we live by. So there's always going to be a divine element and a human element here, just like inspiration. And we're not going to be able to narrow down exactly what that looks like in how God communicated to humans about the canon. There's some tests of canonicity that we'll talk about, but there's going to be a little bit of mystery, just like inspiration, where there's a divine element and a human element involved. Now let's talk about the Old Testament canon. This is, of course, the Tanakh, or the Jewish scriptures of the First Testament. We know that the Jewish community collected and preserved their sacred scriptures. We see a canonization taking place already, writings taking place and being collected. And there's great honor in collecting these writings, and there's importance in them. We see, number two, that the writings of Moses were considered sacred, indicated by the holy place in which they're stored. As it says here in Deuteronomy 31, take the book of the law and put it by the side of the ark and the covenant of the Lord. And we know in 2 Kings 22:8, after the temple was built, the book of the law was found in the house of the Lord. We also see here that there's certainly there's an authority on Moses' writings impressed on Joshua and Israel in Joshua 1:8. We know also in Deuteronomy 17:18-19 that each king of Israel was exhorted to write for himself in a book a copy of this law, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God. So now we have to discuss whether there's a closed or open canon, whether the Old Testament canon was open or closed after 425 BC, after the prophet Malachi, or were new books added. And this is going to have a lot to do with the scriptures that Jesus and the apostles used, of course. Now, we also need to mention what's called the intertestamental period. That is a period between the last writings of the Old Testament, the appearance of Jesus in the New Testament. This is what's called the 400 silent years. That is between Malachi's time at 400 BC to the preaching of John the Baptist at AD 25. And so it is believed that the Holy Spirit was not active at that time, that there's no inspiration going on, there's no inspired writings going on, there's no prophecy going on. And of course, prophecy starts again with John the Baptist. So the question becomes, as we look at some of these books that we have discovered during this period, were they, of course, inspired by God? And we'll talk about some of the problems with that. And so that's why when you get these different canons here, we have to understand that these books that came out during this intertestamental period, that the Catholic canon, the Protestant canon is different, of course, because the Catholic canon recognized some of these books that we're going to talk about. They recognized 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, and a longer version of Esther. The Orthodox Bibles, of course, recognize others as well. They have 2nd Esdras, 1st Esdras, Judith, Tobit, and then 1st and 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. So this leads us to talk about what's called the Pseudepigrapha and the Apocrypha. So the Pseudepigrapha is a grouping of books supposedly written by biblical authors, but actually they're not written by biblical authors because they have false. The names on them are actually false. They're pseudo writings. That means that someone wrote something and put their name as an author there, but they're not the actual author of that book. And so you can read those in James Charlesworth's book here called The Old Testament Pseudepigrapha Writings. These are some of the titles of them on the far left, such as Enoch and 2nd Enoch, 2nd Baruch, 3rd Baruch, Assumption of Moses, the Psalms of Solomon, and other ones. And if you read these, you'll see they're very odd. You can tell that they're much different than a lot of things in the Bible, period, but you can certainly read them. And also, we have the Apocrypha. Now, as I said before, the Catholic canon includes some of these books from the Apocrypha. And let's go ahead and define this. Apocrypha means hidden or secret. We know the Apocrypha is a group of books that appeared during the 400-year interim period between the Old and New Testaments. We know the Jews of the dispersion in Egypt included the books in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That's the Septuagint. We know Jews of Palestine rejected them from the Hebrew canon. And we know at the Council of Trent in 1546 AD that the Roman Catholic Church declared 11 of the 15 books to be included in their Catholic Bible. We do know Jesus never quoted from these books, and we know most of the early church fathers regarded them as uninspired. So why is the Apocrypha rejected in the Protestant canon? Why does your Protestant canon, if you're reading a Protestant Bible, reject it? Well, there's some reasons here. First, during the 2nd century AD, the Alexandrian Jews adopted Aquila's Greek version of the Old Testament without the apocryphal books. We know the manuscripts at the Dead Sea Scroll community made it clear no canonical book of the Old Testament was written later than the Persian period. Third, we know Philo, an Alexandrian Jewish philosopher, quoted the Old Testament in many places and recognized a threefold classification, but he never quoted the Apocrypha as inspired. We also know that Josephus, a very well-known Jewish historian, excludes the Apocrypha, numbering the books of the Old Testament as 22. Neither does he quote the apocryphal books as scripture. We'll talk more about that in a second. We also know that Jesus and the New Testament writers never once quote the Apocrypha, although there's hundreds of quotes and references to almost every book of the Old Testament. We know the Jewish scholars at Jamnia in 90 AD did not recognize the Apocrypha. No canon or council of the Christian church recognized the Apocrypha as inspired for nearly 4 centuries, and we know some of the great church leaders in the early church spoke out against the Apocrypha. Now, obviously, these men are not inspired by God. They're not the same as the apostles, and some of them disagree because some of them did include some of the Apocrypha in their writings, or they mention scriptures from the Apocrypha, so we don't want to make it sound like all of them agreed, but the point is some of them did speak against the Apocrypha. So when it comes to your Protestant canon here, these are the books that are in your Protestant canon, and this is, of course, what is believed that the New Testament authors appealed to when they quoted the Old Testament in their canon, or as far as the canon they're appealing to included these books. And let's look at some of the arguments that Jesus and the apostles were working with a closed canon, that those 39 books were what they were working with. We know that Jesus in Luke 11:51 and Matthew 23:55 refers to the blood of Abel, to the blood of Zechariah, affirming the first book of the Jewish scriptures is Genesis and the last book is 2nd Chronicles. And this affirmation demonstrates that the Jewish canon was closed by the time of Malachi in 425 BC. We know Josephus, as I said, affirmed the arguments that the number of books in the Hebrew canon or Jewish canon was numbered to 22, which according to Jewish numbering is the same as 39 in the Protestant Old Testament canon. Of course, Jesus refers to a 3-part division of the Jewish scriptures. We know that in Luke 24:44, he refers to the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. We know that he does not include anything about the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha. Of course, he says the same thing here in Luke 24:44, that the things that bear witness to who he is are the prophets, the law of Moses, or the Torah, and the Psalms. Matthew 22:40 carries the same implication. On these 2 commandments depend on all the law and the prophets. We see the emphasis on the Torah and the prophets. We see in the early synagogues and the preaching, they read from the Torah and the prophets, the law and the prophets. And we see, thirdly, the 18 of the 22 books of the Old Testament are cited authoritatively in the New Testament, except Judges, Chronicles, Esther, and Song of Solomon. Now, some people say that the canon was not completely closed at the time of Jesus, that they were reading from some of these other books in the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. And we can look at an example here, like in Romans 1, where Paul talks about how God's revealed himself to humanity through creation. They think that Paul may have been, or he may have known about the wisdom of Solomon here, because if you compare the 2 texts, you can read the wisdom of Solomon on the right, which is included in the Catholic canon, but you can read here the differences here. You can see some of the similarities here between the 2, and some people think that perhaps the New Testament authors are reading other books besides just simply those 39 books that we mentioned that are part of your Old Testament canon. Well, we could say in response, it is possible that they had access to them and are reading them, but it's a difference. It doesn't necessarily mean they thought those books were inspired. We can read things all the time that appear to have truth in them. It doesn't mean they're inspired. So we don't know 100% for sure if they were reading from these books. There's, like I said, there is some evidence for it, but we could present arguments on both sides. And we see the same thing with Daniel 7, where Daniel 7 talks about the Son of Man here. We know that Jesus talked about himself as being the Son of Man. It was one of the main ways he describes to himself in the New Testament, describes himself in a way that shows his deity. We see the same thing in 1 Enoch 46 here about the Son of Man. There are other texts in 1 Enoch that speak about a divine Son of Man. So perhaps the New Testament authors were influenced by 1 Enoch. That's one of the arguments some people make, but we'd have to nail down the exact dating of 1 Enoch, and we can certainly speculate they were. It's possible, but do we know 100% for sure? I don't think so, but it's certainly sometimes debated. So we need to remember that as well. Another one is John 1:14 and 1 Enoch 42, 1 through 3. Sounds like some similarities there, possibly, that when the Word became flesh and dwelt among man. Similar passage here about wisdom. Wisdom found not a place on earth that she could inhabit. Her dwelling, therefore, is in heaven, but wisdom went forth to dwell among the sons of man. And so some people think that that maybe influenced John in some way, but we can't say for sure as well. So the conclusion is there's some evidence, or decent evidence, I should say, that Jesus and the apostles had a fixed canon that they used. And we can see here on the left the Old Testament references that they appealed to, the percentages. So we really want to stick with what Jesus and the apostles were reading and what we know from the New Testament. We know also, though, there is disagreement on biblical scholars as to when we have a fixed canon of the Old Testament and whether the canon was fluid. So there's arguments for both sides, and that debate will go on for a while. Now, there's also an ongoing debate whether the Jews at the time of Jesus also had an oral Torah. Now, just remember, number one here, Orthodox Judaism believes that Moses gave Moses explanations, examples of how to interpret the law that Moses did not write down, which is called the oral Torah. So, secondly, the oral Torah was supposedly passed down from Moses to Joshua, then to the rabbis until the beginning advent of the Christian faith, when it's finally written down, called the Halakha, the walk. So if you look today in the rabbinical literature, you'll see the main two sections of the oral Torah, the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is a series of debates about the Mishnah, which together are the Talmud, which is broken up into the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Now, obviously you see the dating there down on the bottom, and so it's hard to say there's good evidence that the Jews at the time had an oral Torah at the time of Jesus, that they had an oral Torah on top of the written Torah. But there's some debate maybe the Pharisees had the starting point of some oral Torah at that time. Maybe they were reading from something that wasn't strictly the written Torah, and maybe that's why they had debates about Jesus on interpretation of the Torah. So this is just something that's discussed, but if you read Michael Brown books here, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, Volume 5, I would agree with him that there's no strong evidence that there was an oral Torah as far as an addition to the written Torah. But Orthodox Jews would probably disagree with you. It just depends on who you talk to. Now let's move on to the New Testament. Why a New Testament canon? Well, we know that we have some issue of the prophetic nature of the apostolic authority of certain books in the New Testament. And certainly it was important to establish what books had apostolic authority and what did not. We know that there was needs of the early communities to communicate doctrine for faith and practice. They needed to know what to believe, and of course, how to live, and that what they believed played a big role in that. So the early communities used the writing of the apostles to establish doctrine to teach. Okay, and then of course you had the growth of heretical movements starting, such as Gnosticism and the Marcionites, and so they needed something to combat the early heretical movements that were starting, so they needed a working canon. Now remember, the New Testament canon did start in the 1st century. It's not something that was totally finished by the 3rd or 4th century like a lot of people think. There's a canonization starting, a writing process that is starting, and books being recognized as having authority. We see where Paul considers Luke's writings as authoritative. We see where Peter recognizes Paul's writings as scripture. And we certainly see books of the New Testament that were being circulated in the early communities. Now, remember, they had no functioning New Testament canon, an actual full-blooded New Testament canon in their hands, right? All they had mostly was the Old Testament canon. But the point is that there were some things being written down early on, and they were being distributed. Remember also, we see a case for oral tradition, just as Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai, that he delivers it to Joshua, Joshua delivers it to the elders, and the elders delivered it to the apostles, and the prophets delivered it to the men of the great synagogue. We see the issue of oral tradition, or what's called Jewish oral tradition. There's a terminology there about delivering, receiving, passing on, and this is what we see here, of course, that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 11 is about Jesus's the issue of the Last Supper, and of course 1 Corinthians 15 about the resurrection. We see this issue of Paul receiving something and passing it on. It's an oral tradition theme. So that's an issue we see canonization is starting in the beginning the time of Jesus. It is starting there in some places. Now, we need to ask also what mechanism was in place to preserve orthodoxy in the New Testament. Darrell Bock argues for these three things. He thinks that there were what's called schooling, hymns, and sacraments. He thinks that there were early creedal formulas starting that were easy to memorize, things about Jesus' death and resurrection, as you read about in 1 Corinthians 8, Romans 1, 2-4, and 1 Corinthians 15. And so he thinks these short creedal formulas are easy to memorize, which they certainly were. And so that was happening early on. You have some hymnals there, hymns in Philippians 2 and Colossians 1 that could be sung, a way to memorize things. And also you have the sacraments of the baptism in communion in 1 Corinthians 11 and Romans 6. And so he thinks these things were in place very early on. We know Paul's letters are the earliest documents we have about Jesus' deity and about his death and resurrection. And these things, some of them are very short formulas and they could be memorized and passed on. So there could be a case, a strong argument made, there was a mechanism in place to preserve some sort of early Orthodox teaching, even though they don't have a full functioning New Testament canon. Remember, the books of the New Testament were written over several decades, but the final books were probably compiled before AD 100. That doesn't mean that we don't have early writings, because we know Paul's letters are the earliest writings of the New Testament. It just means that everything was probably finalized before AD 100, if you go through the datings of the Gospels and compile everything together. We also know that documents traveled slowly 2,000 years ago. It took many years for the books later to be recognized as new to the New Testament to circulate through the Roman Empire. Now, remember, we know that Clement of Rome recognized at least 8 New Testament books by AD 95. We know that Ignatius recognized about 7 books in 115 AD. We know that Polycarp, a disciple of John, acknowledged 15 books by AD 108. We know that Irenaeus recognized 21 books, and we know some of the books were challenged as far as being part of the canon were Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, the book of Revelation. But that's a topic for another time. We can't go through every single issue why there was a challenge for some of those books to make it into the canon. We also have what's called the Muratonian canon, and this is something that was based on a fragment. There was an ancient list of New Testament books, which is the oldest list we have. It's dated to AD 180. It lists 22 of the 27 books that were later included in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. We know that this was discovered by an historian in Italy in 1740, and we know that it included all the New Testament books except Hebrews, 2 Peter, James, and 3 John. So that is one of the oldest lists we have of 22 of the 27 books that later became part of our canon. And then we also know in AD 363, the Council of Laodicea stated that only the Old Testament, along with one book of the Apocrypha and the 26 books of the New Testament, were canonical and to be read in the churches. And then the Council of Hippo in AD 393 and the Council of Carthage in AD 397 affirmed the same 27 books as authoritative. And then we come to the issue of criteria to determine whether a book belongs in the canon. And probably the most important test is the issue of apostolic origin. That means that the books of the New Testament had to be related in some way to one of the authoritative inspired apostles. And number two here, of course, that means the criteria is that a book had to be written by an apostle or one who is under the immediate influence or supervision of an apostle. For example, we know that Luke wrote, but we know he was supervised and approved by Paul. We know that Mark was not an apostle, but he was recognized by Peter because Peter was his eyewitness. And so that's probably one of the most important tests for canonicity is apostolic origin. Another issue criteria that came up was, does the content of a particular book under scrutiny agree with oral apostolic doctrine or the teaching of the apostles? That's why if you read the Gnostic Gospels, you see how different it is from the New Testament writings, and that's why they were rejected. It doesn't line up with what the apostles believed about Jesus. And also, does it agree with the doctrine which the apostles themselves taught orally in person when they were alive on the earth? And then finally, of course, we have some of these early leaders quoting verses from the New Testament early on, such as Justin Martyr, others here, Clement and Tertullian and others, that we see that there must have been some sort of New Testament canon that they were accessing, or they had something they could appeal to when they're quoting from these books. So they recognize them as being part of the canon. Now, remember, these men are not inspired by God, but the point is there must have been some sort of access to some canon of some kind starting or something that they could appeal to when they have all these quotes from the New Testament. So having said that, that'll wrap it up. Remember, if you want to learn more about inspiration, that was in the last presentation on biblical reliability and authority and inspiration. So with that presentation, this one, they kind of complement each other. So I hope they help. Have a good day.